Hi, I'm Paul Carroll, technical writer for Digital Photo Magazine, and welcome to this CameraCraft video tip on understanding metering. Digital cameras have light meters that read the brightness of the light and set the appropriate exposure. This reading can be influenced by two things though: which metering mode is used and which part of the scene the reading is taken from. We're going to look at both of these variables in this video tip and show you how to get the best exposure using your camera's light meter. We'll also look at how digital cameras have made metering much more simple. A quick check of the LCD screen is a really intuitive way of checking an exposure. So once we've looked at some of the theory behind metering, we'll also show you how to check and adjust an exposure the digital way. Most cameras have three metering modes. Each manufacturer gives them different names, but they do the same thing and have similar icons on any camera. Evaluative considers the brightness of the entire scene. Center weighted also evaluates the whole scene, but gives bias towards brightness in the center. And spot metering reads from a very small area for a precise reading. To find out how they work, let's set our camera to evaluative to start with. You can do this either via the camera's menu system or by using a button on the body. Evaluative is fine for most shots because it's clever at working out the right exposure for different scenes. So use this as your default mode. It's not foolproof though, and when there are large bright and dark areas, or if a scene is backlit, it doesn't always get it right. When this happens, you'll need to either switch to spot metering and get a more accurate reading off a specific tone, or adjust the exposure manually. To demonstrate this, we've set up a really simple still life shot. You can try this setup at home. The most important thing is the background is white. A bedsheet or a white wall is fine. For lighting, just use a window or a desk lamp with a reflector to balance the light. Light meters are calibrated to a mid-tone luminance of 18% grey. What this means is the light meter assumes the subject it's reading light from is a mid-tone. If there are a lot of bright tones therefore, like in our high-key still life, evaluative metering sets an exposure that turns our white background a muddy grey, and that's not good. So let's see this in practice. Start by setting your shooting mode to aperture priority. Then frame up and take a meter reading. In this light, evaluative metering is giving us exposure settings of a 40th of a second, f5.6 at ISO 100. The meter reading that you get might differ, but that doesn't matter. Just go with what your camera tells you initially, and then take the first shot. The resulting picture is underexposed, turning the background grey. Now check the histogram, which shows no pixels have been recorded in the brightest highlight region, on the right of the histogram, which is where we want them with this white background. So to get a better exposure, instead of reading the whole scene, we need to take a light meter reading of something we know for sure is a midtone. Nature's reds are often a good midtone, so switch to spot metering and then frame up and position the central AF target over one of these flowers and take another meter reading. A 1/10 of a second, f5.6, ISO 100. That's the exposure we want, but to stop the exposure shifting as we move the AF target away from our midtone, we need to hold down the exposure lock button to store that exposure setting. Now we can recompose and take the second shot. Using this new and more accurate light meter reading, the white background is crisp and clean, and the exposure of the flowers is better too. Be careful when spot metering though. Meter on the wrong area, like a highlight, and the shot will be underexposed or too dark. Or meter on a shadow and the shot will be overexposed and too light. But what can you do if there are no obvious midtones? Well, a good workaround is to adjust the exposure manually using exposure compensation, and then check the shot on the LCD screen. To do this, switch back to evaluative metering, and for that high key look, dial in between +1 to +2 stops of exposure compensation. To dial in some exposure compensation, hold down the +- button and rotate the scroll wheel. For this shot, I'm going to use +2 stops. When you're in aperture priority mode, this lengthens the exposure to overexpose the shot. And now we're getting exposure settings of 1/10 of a second at f5.6 at ISO 100. So let's take the third shot. To make sure the exposure is good, check the image and the histogram on the LCD screen. Don't worry if the histogram shows a spike on the right. That's just our high key background. If the subject is burnt out though, reduce the exposure compensation a little and then shoot again. It really is as easy as that. I hope you've enjoyed this Cameracraft video tip on understanding metering. Why not set up our simple still life shot and you can experiment with evaluative and spot metering modes as well as exposure compensation so you know how to get perfect exposures every time. Okay, see you next month.